Is Royale High making a comeback? Well, honestly, there's some signs to say that it might be. And I know a lot of the times people will paint certain Roblox games against each other, saying there's only room for one game, but I think that's a really harmful narrative to put out there because, in my opinion, there's more than enough room for any sort of Roblox game, especially games in this specific genre because there's so much to do and so much creativity that should be allowed in this space. However, I do often find that people like to compare games a lot. And although I understand it's, a human nature to compare games, especially when you enjoy both of them, I think there's certain things that every game is good at versus, maybe some games are worse at and vice versa. But I want to talk specifically about Royale High today because I've made some videos being critical of the game, which people don't like, and that's okay. You cannot like it when somebody's critical of a game you love, and I understand that. Obviously, if I was super attached to a game and someone was being, critical of it, I wouldn't like that either, so no hate to ya. But I do want to go ahead and make a more positive video with some things that I've noticed recently because I think this may actually help Royale High, kind of bounce back to its former glory. And I'm going to talk about why and the specific things that I think are playing into that, which include their lovely Twitter manager, which I have to give them applause. And I know I've said that a lot, but my goodness, they need a round of applause. So, for those of you that don't know, Royale High has been on the platform for like a super long time, and I think it's a game that a lot of us grew up playing. Personally, I used to enjoy Royale High so much, and I still do enjoy it to a degree. However, I just found that recently it's really hard to kind of get back into it. I find some of the UI is kind of messy for me. It's a little bit difficult now. It's not really so much my game anymore, which is okay because people outgrow games, and that is totally all right. But with that in mind, Royale High for the past couple years has been on somewhat of a downward slope, which I know people won't necessarily agree with me on, and that's okay, but all I'm going to say is numbers don't lie. And Royale High used to average quite a large number of players, and recently, unless they've been, dropping an update, the players have been pretty stagnant at about 8,000 and 10,000 players at one time. And, this is nothing to laugh at, however, it's not nearly as many players as they used to have. And something I want to point out here is that a lot of the times when people point out Royale High's declining player base, they will specifically reference Royale High's, best period as being during 2020. However, I do want to clarify that every game, experienced some sort of surge in their player base during 2020 because why? Everybody was home. So I don't think that's necessarily a fair comparison point. I think it kind of makes unrealistic standards for any game, including Royale High, because the truth is Royale High will never return to the same level of notoriety that it was at during COVID because people aren't stuck at home anymore, and that's just the truth, right? And so I think it's unfair to set expectations between Royale High in 2020 versus now because they just aren't the same kind of standards. I would more so compare it to like 2018, 2019 versus now. I think is a more fairer window, but that's just my opinion. But basically, in recent weeks, Royale High has been honestly just like really popping off on Twitter. And I know the Royale High Twitter community doesn't love me. That's okay, guys. I love you. It's okay. The love can be one-sided. But basically, Royale High has been a lot more active on their Twitter page. And one of the reasons for this, in my personal opinion, is because of their phenomenal community manager on Twitter, which I'm not sure if this is the same manager for other platforms or what, because they're kind of like mysterious, which I like. I think that's fun. But the community manager on Twitter is genuinely the best community manager I've seen for any game, period. And although I've had my, sentiments about Royale High over the years, specifically with the whole influencer scandal that happened about a year ago, this community manager is single-handedly turning the public's perception of the game upside down, in my opinion, in the right way. We can call it backside up because it was upside down and now it's going right side up. But this community manager specifically is always just so kind and genuinely seems really funny, and I really like their witty humor. And what I thought was actually a really good point to make, and I want to share with you guys, was at one point there was somebody who used a word that, it's not inherently super, a negative word. However, they were using it in a negative context, which wasn't very nice. And the word was twink. And although that isn't like an inherent slur, it's okay if you want to call yourself a twink or whatever. However, if you're using it towards somebody and referring to somebody else using that word, it's not nice. You shouldn't do it. And Royale High was very quick to clock it, and they did so in such a respectful way, which is funny because I think a lot of games will be quick to, get on somebody or to, maybe be really aggressive with their statement. But this Royale High community manager really did a good job at, kind of making it like a sandwich where they're like, hey, just so you know, although this may not be widely known, you can't use that word. And they, instead of coming at it from an accusatory standpoint, they came at it from a standpoint of trying to educate and trying to make a more positive relation with the game, which I thought was really good. Now, on top of that, the game has also been showing way more updates, which, something that personally I noticed when I was younger, which I could be wrong. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section. But personally, I noticed that Barbie and, the other developers of the game, they were so ambitious and they want to do these big things and they want to do these massive updates, which I really admire. And I think that's really admirable. However, I think, at least from my experience too, sometimes you have these big ideas, but they're just so big that you don't have enough time to, do them, or you just get overwhelmed and you have to take a break. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people didn't understand that, and it led to people getting upset with how long updates were taking, how things are promised and they couldn't be delivered. And unfortunately, I know that from what I understand, Barbie gets sick quite a bit. I'm not quite sure there's something going on there, or she's a chronic illness. I'm not quite sure as to that respect, and that's just me guessing. I don't know, but I have seen in recent weeks that, especially with her live streaming, she has been getting sick quite a bit, and that was something that was previously discussed in past years with live streams and stuff like that, or updates that somebody on the team was sick and so they couldn't do an update. And what I really admire is that, they still had big dreams, but it seems like now they're almost pivoting to doing smaller updates, but more frequent updates, which I feel like is the best possible method for a game. It's a lot of fun to have a massive update where you feel like you get this massive revamp and there's so much to explore, but the truth is, after like 2-3 hours, you've explored it all probably, and you're bored again. Which is why I think games doing smaller updates or weekly updates on a specific date is such a smart move, because it keeps players engaged and it keeps them looking forward to something every week. Because if you get a massive update once every 6 months, that's awesome. But for 6 months, what do I do now? I finished the update and it's going to make your player base drop. However, when you have weekly updates and consistent communication with their player base, it actually incentivizes people to play your game more. And that's what Royale High has been doing. First of all, Barbie has been streaming a lot more on Twitch, which that really helps the community, develop a more personal relationship with the creator, and it helps them feel kind of like they're behind the scenes and creates this really, loyal fan base behind your game, which they already have a loyal fan base, but when you're communicating directly with players and, making them feel heard in a live setting, it creates this even more, bigger sense of loyalty where they feel more personally attached to your game, which means they're more personally invested, which means they're more likely to spend money and play your game in the future. And what's also interesting is during these live streams, she would kind of do them spontaneously, which always left people kind of like on the edge of their seat, like, oh, is Barbie going to stream tonight? I wonder if she's going to go live, which led to people following her, having notifications on, and people always checking in to see if Barbie's going to be online, which is honestly such a smart thing. I don't know if she does that intentionally, but marketing-wise, it's a very, very smart move. Now, alongside that, there's been tons of teases for new sets in the Royale High community, which I think is really cool because, Royale High, they have lots of clothing items. And, again, I haven't necessarily played the game since I was a bit younger. I did try to get back into it recently. It just, I don't know, it doesn't feel the same. That's just my opinion, and I'm sorry. But I was a really big Royale High fan back in the day, and I played the game a lot. And, I worked my way up in the trading, hierarchy, and I have lots of high value items. But something that I found was that there just wasn't a ton of item releases. And I understand, I try to be empathetic to the fact that making items and intricate sets is obviously a lot harder than most people would expect. And I'm not trying to sit here and be like, oh, it's so easy, you should just do it, just see how I make it. Because I'm not naive in that sense, right? However, what I think is really interesting is that recently they've been teasing so many new sets, and I genuinely feel like that's what's making players so excited, is that players are reposting the sets and they get another piece of a set and another piece of a set. And they're reposting it, and the community, hype for it is further boosting the game and making new players interested in the game because they're like, oh, why is this creator posting about this? What is this for? It actually, causes so much interaction and traction for the game that it actually indirectly boosts the game's performance altogether in their community, which I think is really interesting. And as I'm talking, I'm sure I'll put some pictures of some of the new sets on my screen, but there's just so much going on in Royale High right now, and I generally think that starting with the community manager, that has created such a different perception of the game publicly and has created a much more positive rather than toxic, communication style between the game team and the general public that has made players feel more emotionally invested in the game like they used to be. On top of that, the more consistent updates, and at least what seems like their attempt at doing more consistent updates, has been making the community feel some sort of almost sense of hope or anticipation that they could be getting, some more frequent content in the game, which for creators, especially creators that do Royale High content, if you don't get game updates, there's only a certain amount of content you can make on the base game itself. The biggest videos and the videos that do the best are the ones where you're talking about something new and exciting because players want to learn about that. And so not only does this helping Royale High, but it's also going to help Royale High creators in the space who want to make tutorial content or want to make update content, and which in turn will further help Royale High because when creators make content about a game gets more viewers. So altogether, I feel like honestly this is the perfect storm for Royale High to see a resurgence in their player base, which I know a lot of people will say, oh, well, Royale High, they're already doing pretty good, they have lots of players, and I agree. However, the player count isn't the same as it was back in 2018, 2019, which isn't necessarily bad because, of course, people outgrow games and people move on, and that's okay. Everybody does that. That's what I personally did with Royale High, and that's totally okay. However, when a game doesn't have updates, they don't attract new players, and so what's really smart is that now that Royale High is, attempting to do more consistent updates, they're actually attracting newer players and even older players who played the game previously and want to see the game grow, which I think is going to be a really nice mix of players in the community. So you don't just have super young players, you also have older players, so you can have a variety of perspectives and, different voices in the community, which I think is really, really important when it comes to commentary and news content. But regardless, let me know what you guys think about this in the comment section below. Do you think Royale High is making a comeback? What are your thoughts on this? this, and what are you most anticipating with these new updates and features that are being added? Let me know down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye bye!